October 24th, 1944. Imperial Japanese Navy Operations Room, Combined Fleet Headquarters, Brunei. Commander Yasuji Watanabe's hands shook as he compiled reconnaissance reports from the Battle of Leyte Gulf, now entering its second day. His intelligence brief contained an observation that would fundamentally alter Japanese naval doctrine for the war's remaining months, though by then it would be far too late to matter. American carrier observed recovering aircraft at intervals impossible by our calculations. Estimated cycle time, 60 to 90 seconds per aircraft. Request verification, as this exceeds known carrier operational parameters. The report came from a Yokosuka D4Y Judy dive bomber pilot who had survived an attack run on Task Group 38.3. The pilot, Lieutenant Masao Yamaguchi, had circled at maximum altitude after his bombing run, documenting American carrier operations through his gun camera before escaping. What he filmed contradicted everything the Imperial Japanese Navy understood about carrier warfare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Watanabe had served aboard the carrier Shokaku before its sinking on June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. He knew carrier operations intimately. Aircraft recovery was the vulnerable moment, the dangerous dance when flight decks became parking lots, when defensive capability plummeted, when a carrier transformed from weapons platform to helpless target. Japanese carrier doctrine, refined through years of training and combat experience from Pearl Harbor through Midway, through the Solomon Islands campaign, assumed certain immutable facts about carrier operations. Aircraft recovery required clearing the flight deck. Each aircraft needed approximately 5 to 7 minutes from barrier, engagement to movement to the forward deck or hangar. During recovery operations, carriers could not launch additional aircraft. The entire process for recovering a full air group required between 45 minutes to 90 minutes, during which the carrier was maximally vulnerable. American carriers, Japanese intelligence assessed, operated under the same physical constraints. Steel decks could only accommodate so many aircraft. Recovery barriers needed resetting between landings. Aircraft required time to fold wings, taxi forward, and clear the landing area. These weren't matters of doctrine or training, they were physics, engineering, immutable realities of carrier aviation. Lieutenant Yamaguchi's gun camera footage, reviewed by Commander Watanabe and senior staff, showed something different. The American carrier, later identified as USS Essex, CV-9, the lead ship of its class, recovered aircraft in a continuous stream that seemed to violate every principle of carrier operations. Aircraft touched down, engaged barriers, and disappeared forward. Before observers could process what had occurred, another aircraft was already in the landing pattern. Watanabe counted frames on the film projector, calculating time intervals. 67 seconds, 73 seconds, 81 seconds, 59 seconds. The carrier recovered aircraft faster than Japanese doctrine said was physically possible, and it did so while maintaining combat air patrol, while launching additional strikes, while conducting defensive operations against the very attack Yamaguchi had participated in. The Essex-class carriers represented something Japanese naval aviation had not anticipated. American engineers had redesigned carrier warfare itself. The genesis of speed construction of USS Essex began on April 28, 1941, at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, 7 months before Pearl Harbor. The Navy's Bureau of Ships, learning from the Yorktown class, carriers and studying combat reports from the European theatre, had identified carrier aircraft recovery as the critical bottleneck in sustained operations. Commander Joseph F. Jocko Clark, who would later command USS Hornet and pioneering fast carrier tactics, participated in the design review board. In classified meetings during 1940 and 1941, the board addressed fundamental questions. How could carriers maintain higher operational tempo? How could they defend themselves during the vulnerable recovery phase? How could they maximize the number of sorties per day? The answers lay in a series of interconnected innovations, each seemingly minor but collectively revolutionary. The Essex-class flight deck measured 862 feet in length and extended to 108 feet in width at its maximum point. Substantially larger than the Shokaku class, which measured 845 feet by 85 feet. This additional width, those 23 feet, proved critical. American naval architects implemented a deck-edge elevator system, positioning one elevator on the port-side deck edge rather than in the flight deck centerline. This innovation, which Japanese carriers never adopted, meant recovery operations could continue while aircraft moved to and from the hangar deck. The centerline elevator didn't create a hole in the landing area during operations, but the true revolution lay in the barrier and taxi system. Essex-class carriers used 9 cross-deck arresting wires, with the wires spaced at 20-foot intervals. Behind these, they installed multiple crash barriers that could be raised and lowered in under 15 seconds compared to 90 seconds for barriers on Japanese carriers. Japanese carriers used 3 to 5 arresting wires with crash barriers that required manual resetting between each aircraft. Most critically, Essex carriers implemented double-deck parking. As aircraft landed and cleared the queso, arresting wires, deck crews immediately taxied them to a forward parking area on the starboard side of the flight deck or to the deck-edge elevators. The wider deck allowed aircraft to be spotted in dense packs while maintaining a clear centerline for landing operations. Japanese carriers, with narrower decks, could not park aircraft forward without creating dangerous congestion that blocked recovery operations. December 7, 1941 to October 1944, two navies diverge. When USS Essex commissioned on December 31, 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had already been at war for 12 months. Japanese carrier doctrine, forged in that year of victories, emphasized strike power over recovery capability. The 6 fleet carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, could each launch devastating strikes with their highly trained air groups. But recovery operations revealed doctrinal assumptions that would prove fatal. Japanese carriers recovered aircraft sequentially. Each aircraft engaged the arresting wire, rolled backward slightly as the wire absorbed energy, then waited while deck crews manually reset the barrier before taxiing forward. This process required approximately 5 to 7 minutes per aircraft under optimal conditions. Captain Tamichi Hara, who commanded the destroyer Shigure escorting carriers throughout the Pacific War, observed carrier recovery operations repeatedly. In his memoir, Japanese Destroyer Captain, written after the war, Hara noted, "Our carrier recovery operations seemed interminable. Aircraft circled endlessly, fuel gauges approaching empty, while deck crews worked with desperate efficiency that was never quite efficient enough. I watched pilots ditch alongside their carriers, out of fuel, having survived combat only to perish meters from safety because our decks could not accept them quickly enough." The Battle of the Coral Sea, on May 7th through 8th, 1942, demonstrated these limitations catastrophically. The carrier Shokaku, despite surviving American attacks with 3 bomb hits, required nearly 2 hours to recover its returning strike force. During this period, the carrier could not conduct defensive operations, could not launch replacement fighters, could not maneuver aggressively while aircraft were in the landing pattern. Lieutenant Commander Takahashi, Air Operations Officer aboard Shokaku, filed a report that remained classified until after the war. Recovery operations created maximum vulnerability period, extending beyond 90 minutes. Recommend investigation of rapid recovery procedures. The report was noted and filed. No changes were implemented. At the Battle of Midway on June 4, 1942, when American dive bombers caught the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu with armed and fueled aircraft on their flight decks, those aircraft were there partly because Japanese carriers lacked the capability to rapidly recover, rearm, refuel, and relaunch them. The doctrine that emphasized devastating initial strikes over sustained operations had created a vulnerability that American carriers, by late 1944, had systematically eliminated. October 1944. Essex-class operations at Leyte Gulf. By October 1944, 17 Essex-class carriers were operational in the Pacific Fleet. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, these carriers demonstrated capabilities that Japanese observers found incomprehensible. Task Force 38, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, consisted of 4 task groups built around Essex-class carriers. On October 24th, these carriers launched hundreds of sorties against Japanese naval forces, converging on Leyte Gulf from multiple directions. The carrier USS Intrepid, CV-11, demonstrated the Essex-class capability that most shocked Japanese observers. Intrepid launched morning strikes against the Japanese center force at 05:45 hours. Aircraft departed in a continuous stream: 21 fighters, 15 dive bombers, 16 torpedo bombers. The launch sequence required 43 minutes. When these aircraft returned at 09:17 hours, Intrepid recovered all 52 aircraft in 58 minutes, an average of 1 aircraft every 67 seconds. During recovery, Intrepid simultaneously launched a 12-aircraft combat air patrol replacement, maintained radar picket fighters at altitude, and prepared a second strike for launch immediately after recovery operations completed. The carrier transitioned from recovery to launching again in 23 minutes. Commander John S. Jimmy Thach, architect of the Thach-Weave fighter tactic and now serving on Admiral McCain's staff, observed these operations from the carrier Hancock. In his operation reports, Thach wrote, "The Essex carriers have transformed carrier warfare from sequential operations to simultaneous operations. We recover while we launch. We rearm while we fly. The flight deck is never static, never waiting. This is warfare at industrial tempo, not human tempo." Lieutenant Yamaguchi, the Japanese pilot whose gun camera captured Essex recovery operations, reported details that Japanese naval staff initially dismissed as combat stress or observational error. His official interrogation transcript, preserved in Japanese naval archives, records his testimony. The American carrier maintained continuous operations. Aircraft landed in rapid succession. I counted 12 aircraft in 14 minutes. During this time, the carrier launched 6 fighters. The flight deck appeared chaotic, but the chaos was organized. Every crew member knew their position. Aircraft moved in predetermined patterns. It was like watching a factory, not a military operation. Yamaguchi's reference to a factory was more accurate than he knew. Essex-class carriers were designed explicitly as aircraft production facilities, not producing aircraft themselves, but producing sorties, the industrial output of carrier warfare, the human system behind the speed. What Japanese observers could not see from gun camera footage or periscope observation were the human systems that enabled 90-second recovery cycles. The Essex-class flight deck crew consisted of approximately 250 personnel during flight operations, compared to 180 on Japanese carriers. Each crew member wore color-coded uniforms indicating their specific function, a system Japanese carriers never implemented. Red shirts, ordnance handlers and weapons personnel. Yellow shirts, aircraft handling officers and catapult crews. Blue shirts, aircraft elevator operators and tractor drivers. Arresting gear and catapult maintenance crews. Purple shirts, aviation fuel handlers, brown shirts, plane captains and aircraft maintenance crews. White shirts, safety observers, medical personnel, and quality control. This color coding allowed instant identification of crew roles during the organized chaos of recovery operations. The air boss, operating from Pri-Fly primary flight control, 7 stories above the flight deck, could identify problems instantly by observing color patterns on the deck below. Lieutenant Commander John Jack Raby, air boss aboard USS Lexington CV-16 during Leyte Gulf, described the recovery system in post-war interviews. Every recovery was choreographed like a ballet, except our dancers wore steel-toed boots and worked around propellers spinning at 2,000 RPM. The landing signal officer brought aircraft aboard. The moment wheels touched, 10 different things happened simultaneously. Arresting gear crews, verified wire engagement. Aircraft handling officers directed taxi patterns. Plane captains ran to aircraft to assist pilots. Tractor crews positioned to tow aircraft forward. Medical personnel stood ready for injured pilots. Quality control inspectors checked for combat damage. All within the first 30 seconds after landing. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Japanese naval system, by contrast, emphasized individual excellence over systematic coordination. Japanese deck crews were highly trained, but they operated with less specialized role definition. The same personnel might handle arresting wires on one landing, assist with aircraft taxiing on the next, and prepare ordnance on a third. This flexibility was valued in Japanese military culture, but it prevented the assembly line efficiency that characterized Essex-class operations. Commander Watanabe, analyzing American carrier operations after reviewing captured documents during the occupation period, wrote in a 1946 report for U.S. Naval Intelligence, American Carrier. The operations were designed around the assumption that any individual might fail, but the system would succeed. Japanese carrier operations were designed around the assumption that every individual would perform flawlessly, making systematic redundancy unnecessary. Under combat stress, when individuals cannot perform flawlessly, American systems proved more resilient. Quantifying the gap, numbers that told the story. By late 1944, the operational gap between Essex-class carriers and surviving Japanese carriers had become mathematically insurmountable. The numbers revealed not just a technological difference, but a civilizational difference in approach to warfare. Essex-class CV-9 specifications. Flight deck, 862 feet by 108 feet. Aircraft capacity, 90 to 100 aircraft. War, loading. Arresting wires, 9 cross-deck wires. Barriers, multiple crash barriers. 15-second reset time elevators. 3 total, including 1 deck edge. Elevator, recovery time, 60 to 90 seconds per aircraft average. Daily sortie capacity, 250 to 300 sorties under combat conditions. Flight deck crew, 250 personnel during operations. Fuel capacity for aircraft, 300,000 gallons of aviation gasoline. Ammunition storage. Capacity for extended operations without resupply. Japanese Shokaku-class specifications. Flight deck, 845 feet by 85 feet aircraft capacity. 72 aircraft, standard, complement. Arresting wires, 5 cross-deck wires. Barriers, single crash barrier, 90-second reset time elevators. 2 centerline elevators. Recovery time, 5 to 7 minutes per aircraft average. Daily sortie capacity, 120 to 150 sorties. Maximum flight deck crew, 180 personnel during operations. Fuel capacity for aircraft, limited, requiring frequent resupply. Ammunition storage, adequate for initial operations, limited. Sustainability. These specifications translated into operational reality during sustained combat. An Essex-class carrier could launch and recover its entire air group twice daily, while maintaining continuous combat air patrol and conducting opportunistic strikes. A Japanese carrier launching a full strike required the entire day for launch, recovery, rearming, refueling, and preparing for a second strike. The Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th through 20th, 1944, known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, demonstrated this disparity catastrophically for Japan. American carriers launched over 900 sorties across 2 days. Japanese carriers, fielding their last experienced air groups, managed approximately 373 sorties before losing 3 carriers and approximately 600 aircraft. American carriers recovered aircraft continuously throughout both days, maintaining combat air patrol that decimated Japanese attacks. Japanese carriers, struggling with slower recovery operations, could not sustain defensive fighter coverage while recovering strike aircraft. When American submarines USS Albacore and USS Kavala attacked, the carriers Taiho and Shokaku were both recovering aircraft, their decks crowded with returning planes, their defensive fighter coverage depleted, their maneuverability compromised. The pilot experience, 2 different wars. For the pilots themselves, American and Japanese, the difference in recovery capabilities meant flying 2 entirely different wars. American pilots launched knowing their carriers would be ready to receive them. Japanese pilots launched increasingly uncertain whether their carriers would still exist when they returned, or if they did exist, whether fuel exhaustion would claim them before the slow recovery process could accommodate their landing. Ensign Robert Lawson, flying an F-6F Hellcat from USS Essex during Leyte Gulf, described the psychological confidence this created. "You knew the ship would be there. You knew they'd bring you aboard. I saw guys come back shot up, engines smoking, hydraulics gone, and the LSO would bring them aboard anyway. One guy landed with his landing gear collapsed, tail hook dragging, and they had him off the deck and another aircraft landing in 83 seconds. I timed it. That kind of confidence changes everything about how you fight." Japanese pilots experienced the opposite. Lieutenant Masatake Okumiya, who survived the war and later became a respected military historian, wrote about the psychological impact of uncertain recovery in his book, Zero, The Story of Japan's Air War in the Pacific. "We launched into uncertainty. Would our carrier survive the battle? Would fuel last for the return flight? Would the carrier be recovering other aircraft when we arrived, forcing us to circle until fuel exhaustion? These anxieties were always present, always draining mental energy that should have been focused on combat. The fuel calculation alone created unbearable stress. Japanese naval aircraft typically carried enough fuel for mission duration plus approximately 20 to 30 minutes reserve. If carriers required 90 minutes to recover a full strike, aircraft arriving first would circle, burning precious fuel, while later aircraft landed. Pilots frequently faced the choice: ditch alongside the carrier and await rescue, or attempt a landing with insufficient fuel, risking a deck crash that might kill deck crew and damage the carrier. Lieutenant Commander Sadamu Komachi, a dive bomber pilot aboard Zuikaku, described this calculus in his diary entry from August 9th, 1944. Returned from strike on American carriers with fuel indicator showing empty. Circled for 17 minutes while deck cleared previous landings. Fuel pressure dropping. Made approach with engine sputtering. Landed successfully but engine died during taxi. Aircraft handler reported I had fumes remaining, nothing more. This is how we fight now. Gambling on fumes, hoping the carrier will be ready before physics makes the decision for us." October 25th, 1944. The Battle off Cape Engano. The final carrier battle of World War II occurred on October 25, 1944, when American Task Force 38 engaged the Japanese Northern Force off Cape Engano. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese carriers Zuikaku, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho, the last operational carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. These carriers, sailing with minimal air groups as decoys to lure American carriers away from Leyte Gulf, faced the full might of the Essex-class fast carrier force. The engagement demonstrated the Essex-class capabilities under maximum operational stress. American carriers launched continuous strikes throughout the day, maintaining combat air patrol, conducting photo reconnaissance, and replacing depleted aircraft without pause. USS Lexington CV-16 Air Operations Log, October 25, 1944, preserved in National Archives. 06:15 hours. Launched first strike. 24 fighters, 16 dive bombers, 12 torpedo bombers. Launch time, 37 minutes. 08:53 hours. Recovered night fighters from CAP. 4 aircraft, 4 minutes 30 seconds total. 09:42 hours. Launched replacement CAP, 8 fighters. Launch time, 9 minutes. 10:27 hours. Recovered first strike, 49 of 52 aircraft, 3 combat losses. Recovery time, 62 minutes. Average time per aircraft, 76 seconds. 1:45 hours. Launched second strike, 26 fighters, 12 dive bombers, 14 torpedo bombers. Launch time, 41 minutes. 13:08 hours. Recovered CAP replacement, 8 fighters. Recovery time, 7 minutes. 15:33 hours. Recovered second strike, 50 of 52 aircraft. Recovery time, 58 minutes. Average time per aircraft, 69 seconds. This operational tempo launching, recovering, rearming, refueling, and launching again continued for 14 hours of continuous operations. Lexington conducted 6 major strike launches, 8 CAP replacements, recovered over 200 aircraft, and maintained continuous combat operations throughout the day. The carrier transitioned between recovery and launch operations, with an average turnaround time of 22 minutes. Aboard the Japanese carrier Zuikaku, the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force, operations reflected a different reality. The carrier launched its 30 aircraft early in the morning, its entire operational air group, depleted from months of combat losses and inability to replace trained pilots. These aircraft, primarily fighters tasked with defending the decoy force rather than attacking American ships, faced overwhelming American numerical superiority. Commander Kaname Harada, Zuikaku's air operations officer, survived the carrier's sinking and later provided testimony about that final day. "We launched everything we had. 30 aircraft, many piloted by flyers with minimal training. They took off, knowing they would not return, not because this was a special attack mission, but because we knew American fighters would destroy them, and even if they survived, we knew Zuikaku would be sunk before they could return. The mathematics were inescapable. We faced 8 American carriers capable of launching strikes continuously. We had 4 carriers with 30 aircraft total. This was not a battle. It was an execution. By day's end, all 4 Japanese carriers had been sunk. Zuikaku, hit by multiple torpedo and bomb strikes, capsized and sank at 14:14 hours. The last Japanese carrier that attacked Pearl Harbor disappeared beneath the Pacific, taking with it any remaining illusion that Japanese carriers could contest American naval aviation. The underlying philosophy: speed as strategy. What Japanese commanders struggled to comprehend was that American carrier recovery speed wasn't merely a technical achievement, it was a manifestation of fundamentally different strategic thinking. Japanese naval doctrine, inherited from British naval tradition and shaped by Japan's resource constraints, viewed carriers as precision instruments. Each aircraft was valuable. Each mission was carefully planned. Recovery operations were methodical processes that prioritized aircraft preservation. American naval doctrine, developed in the interwar period and refined through combat experience, viewed carriers as sortie-generation machines. Individual aircraft were mass-produced assets. Missions were continuous rather than discrete events. Recovery operations were optimized for volume throughput rather than individual preservation. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who commanded the Fifth Fleet at the Battle of Philippine Sea and later during the Okinawa Campaign, articulated this philosophy in a classified memorandum to Admiral Nimitz dated September 5, 1944. Our carriers must be understood not as ships that carry aircraft, but as factories that produce combat sorties. Every minute of recovery time saved is a sortie gained. Every hour of operational tempo sustained is a battle won. The Japanese count aircraft. We count sorties per day. This difference is mathematical, measurable, and ultimately decisive. This philosophy extended throughout the Essex-class design. Damage control systems were designed for rapid repair and continued operations rather than optimal preservation. Aircraft repair facilities aboard each carrier enabled quick restoration of damaged aircraft to operational status. Parts and ammunition stores were designed for sustained operations rather than single-mission loadouts. The Essex-class carriers included facilities Japanese carriers lacked entirely: complete machine shops, aircraft engine repair capabilities, electronics workshops, and extensive spare parts inventory. USS Intrepid, during the Leyte Gulf operations, carried enough spare parts to rebuild 17 complete aircraft from components, enough ammunition for 3 weeks of continuous operations, and enough aviation gasoline for 5,200 aircraft sorties. Personal accounts: the view from the deck. The human experience of Essex-class recovery operations revealed the organizational sophistication required to achieve 90-second recovery cycles. These weren't automatic processes, they were coordinated human actions perfected through training and maintained through discipline under extreme stress. Chief Aviation Boatswain's mate John Jack Faulkner served aboard USS Hancock CV-19 throughout 1944 and 45. In Oral History, interviews conducted in 1998, Faulkner described typical recovery operations. The air boss would call from Pry-Fly, "Prepare to recover aircraft." That started the ballet. Crash barriers raised, medical personnel positioned, fire crews ready. LSO took his station. Arresting gear crews checked wire tension. Aircraft handling officers positioned across the deck. Everyone had about 90 seconds to prepare from the call to first aircraft touching down. The LSO would bring the first aircraft aboard. Wheels touch, hook grabs the 3-wire that's optimal, aircraft rolls backward about 6 feet as the wire absorbs energy. The moment we confirm good wire engagement, aircraft captain runs to the plane, guides the pilot to fold wings if it's a Hellcat or Avenger. Tractor crew hooks up. Aircraft handler signals the direction. Hook crew verifies no damage to arresting wire, all in maybe 20 seconds. Barrier drops. Aircraft taxis forward or goes to the elevator. Barrier raises. Next aircraft is already in the groove. LSO brings him aboard. Same process. We did this 40, 50, 60 times in a row. Every 60 to 90 seconds, another aircraft. You couldn't think about it or you'd mess up. Your body knew the movements. Your crew knew the choreography. We were components in a machine, except the machine was human. For the landing signal officer, the sailor responsible for guiding aircraft to successful landings, the pressure was extraordinary. LSO brought aircraft aboard in all conditions. Aircraft damaged by combat, pilots wounded, fuel critically low, decks pitching in heavy seas, visibility reduced by weather or smoke from combat operations. Lieutenant Junior Grade William Marsh Beakley served as LSO aboard USS Ticonderoga CV-14 during 1944 and 45. His account, preserved in Naval History and Heritage Command oral histories, describes the concentration required. You had about 10 seconds to evaluate each aircraft. Is it damaged? Is the pilot struggling? Does the approach look stable? You're processing information at incredible speed. Simultaneously, you're watching the deck crew, watching the barriers, watching the aircraft in the landing pattern behind this one, and maintaining radio communication with Fly. If you wave off an aircraft unnecessarily, you've wasted fuel and time. If you bring aboard an aircraft that should have been waved off, people die. The worst was when pilots came back wounded. You could sometimes tell by how they flew the pattern. Too shallow, too steep, unstable corrections. You'd bring them aboard and immediately see blood in the cockpit when they popped the canopy. The corpsman would be there in seconds, but those seconds felt eternal. You'd have another aircraft in the pattern 30 seconds later. No time to think about the injured pilot. Just bring the next one aboard safely. Japanese carriers used landing signal officers as well, but the role was less formalized, less systematized. Lieutenant Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant naval aviators, and later a post-war air self-defense force general, observed American LSO operations during the occupation period. In a 1948 report to the emerging Japanese self-defense forces, Genda wrote, "The American landing signal system is not merely a procedure, but a philosophy. They have formalized every aspect of aircraft recovery, creating redundant safety systems that allow sustained high-tempo operations. Our LSO procedures emphasized individual pilot skill. American procedures assume pilots will be fatigued, damaged aircraft will be common, and high operational tempo is mandatory. Their system succeeds when individuals are imperfect. Our system required perfection and collapsed when perfection became impossible under combat stress. The mathematical reality. Sortie generation as decisive factor. By late 1944, American naval analysts had quantified the decisive advantage Essex-class recovery speeds created. These calculations, preserved in Strategic Bombing Survey documents and Navy operational analysis reports, revealed the compounding effect of recovery time on overall combat effectiveness. Consider a theoretical scenario with identical combat conditions. Scenario 1. Essex-class carrier air group, 100 aircraft. Launch time for full strike, 45 minutes. Recovery time, 90 seconds per aircraft, total 60 minutes for full recovery. Turnaround time, rearming, refueling, 90 minutes. Total cycle time, 4 hours 15 minutes. Sorties per day, approximately 240, assuming 3 full strikes, plus CAP scenario. 2. Japanese Fleet Carrier Air Group, 72 aircraft. Launch time for full strike, 50 minutes. Recovery time, 6 minutes per aircraft. Total, 432 minutes for full recovery. Approximately 120, assuming 2 strikes plus, limited cap. This mathematical reality meant that a single Essex-class carrier could generate approximately twice the sorties per day as a Japanese fleet carrier, even before accounting for superior American aircraft performance, better pilot training, and more effective operational coordination. 4 Essex-class carriers could generate more sorties than the entire Japanese carrier force at the war's peak. The implications extended beyond immediate combat. Higher sortie generation rates meant more strikes against enemy targets, more opportunities to find and attack enemy forces, better continuous air coverage for defensive operations, and greater resilience to combat losses. An Essex-class carrier losing 10 aircraft to combat and accidents retained 90 aircraft and continued operations at minimal reduced tempo. A Japanese carrier losing 10 aircraft from a 72-aircraft complement lost nearly 14% of combat capability and faced significantly reduced operational tempo due to smaller air groups, creating recovery bottlenecks. Technological integration, the hidden advantage. What Japanese observers could not see from external observation were the integrated technological systems that enabled Essex-class recovery speeds. These systems, developed in the late 1930s and early 1940s, represented American engineering philosophy applied to carrier aviation. The Merc 4 hydraulic arresting gear system, standard on Essex-class carriers, could absorb the kinetic energy of aircraft weighing up to 20,000 pounds, landing at speeds up to 90 miles per hour. The system automatically adjusted to aircraft weight through a clever mechanical governor that varied hydraulic resistance based on wire pull-out speed. This meant pilots of different aircraft types could land without individual arresting wire pressure adjustments. The system compensated automatically. Japanese carriers used hydraulically operated arresting gear as well, but with manual pressure, adjustments required for different aircraft weights and landing speeds. Deck crews needed approximately 30 to 45 seconds between landings to adjust hydraulic pressure settings. This seemingly minor difference accumulated across dozens of aircraft recoveries, adding 20 to 30 minutes to total recovery operations. The Mark V crash barrier system, also standard on Essex-class carriers, could be raised or lowered in 15 seconds using electric motors and counterweight systems. The barriers themselves used nylon webbing that could stop aircraft weighing up to 18,000 pounds, travelling at 30 miles per hour without causing catastrophic airframe damage. Japanese carriers used wire cable barriers requiring manual winching, with 90-second deployment times. Flight deck lighting systems on Essex-class carriers included specialized landing lights, deck edge lighting, and illuminated landing signal systems that enabled night recovery operations. Japanese carriers had minimal deck lighting, severely limiting night operations. This proved increasingly critical as the war progressed, and American carriers extended operations into night hours, effectively doubling the available operational period, while Japanese carriers remained constrained to daylight operations. August 1945. The final accounting. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had effectively ceased to exist. Of the carriers that fought at Pearl Harbor, all had been sunk. The Shokaku-class carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, widely regarded as the finest carriers Japan produced, both lay on the ocean floor. The vaunted First Air Fleet, the Kido Butai, existed only in memory. In contrast, the United States Navy operated 99 aircraft carriers of all types in August 1945, including 27 Essex-class fleet carriers. These carriers, produced at a rate Japanese industry could never approach, represented not just numerical superiority, but operational superiority in every measurable parameter. The Essex-class carriers served beyond World War II, participating in the Korean War, Vietnam War, and serving as recovery ships for Apollo space missions. USS Lexington CV-16, commissioned in February 1943, served continuously until November 1991, a 48-year operational career that spanned from propeller aircraft to jet aircraft to helicopters. The class proved so successful that no American purpose-built fleet carriers were constructed between 1943 and 1952. The Essex class adequately met all requirements. Post-war analysis by Japanese and American naval historians identified carrier operations as one of several critical American advantages that proved decisive. The ability to generate more sorties per day, to recover aircraft faster, to maintain continuous operations under combat. Stress these capabilities multiplied American numerical advantages and effectively negated Japanese tactical innovations. The human cost. Behind the statistics and operational analysis were human beings, young men who flew, fought, and often died in service to their nations. The Essex-class recovery capabilities saved American lives by enabling rapid aircraft recovery under combat conditions, but they could not prevent all losses. During 1944 and 45, Essex-class carriers lost approximately 1,200 aircraft to combat and operational accidents. Approximately 900 aircrew died in these losses. The carriers themselves suffered casualties from kamikaze attacks and operational accidents. USS Franklin CV-13 suffered 724 killed and 265 wounded when hit by Japanese bombers. on March 19, 1945, making it the most damaged carrier to survive the war. Japanese naval aviation losses during the same period approached 90% of all pilots who flew combat missions. The Imperial Japanese Navy's inability to recover aircraft quickly, to sustain high operational tempos, to generate adequate sortie numbers contributed to pilot exhaustion, inadequate training for replacement pilots, and ultimately to the decision to employ kamikaze tactics when conventional operations proved unsustainable. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived the war, wrote in his memoir about visiting American carriers during the occupation period. I walked the flight decks of Essex carriers moored in Tokyo Bay and understood finally what we had fought against. These were not merely ships, they were floating air bases that could generate sorties at rates we never achieved from land bases. The recovery systems, the barriers, the lighting, the arresting gear, each component represented thinking we had not done. We built beautiful carriers and trained magnificent pilots, but we never systematically addressed the mechanical problem of recovering aircraft quickly enough to sustain combat operations. This oversight cost us the war as surely as any tactical defeat. The legacy. The story of Japanese commanders, stunned by USS Essex carriers recovering aircraft in 90 seconds, is ultimately a story about systematic thinking, applied to warfare. American naval architects and operational planners identified carrier aircraft recovery as a critical bottleneck and systematically eliminated that bottleneck through integrated engineering, procedural innovation, and crew training. Japanese naval designers built magnificent carriers, beautiful, fast, well-armed vessels that reflected Japan's shipbuilding excellence. But they never systematically addressed recovery speed as a critical operational parameter. They assumed all carriers shared similar recovery limitations and built their doctrine around those assumed limitations. When American carriers demonstrated recovery speeds 3 to 4 times faster than Japanese carriers, the entire Japanese naval aviation doctrine became obsolete. Today, the USS Yorktown CV-10, an Essex-class carrier commissioned on April 15, 1943, serves as a museum ship in Charleston, South Carolina. Visitors walk the flight deck, visit the hangar deck, tour the ready rooms where pilots prepared for combat missions. The arresting wires remain in place. The crash barriers stand ready, frozen in time. The deck markings, worn but visible, show where aircraft taxied after recovery. Standing on that flight deck, one can imagine the organized chaos of recovery operations, aircraft landing every 90 seconds, deck crews swarming each aircraft, barriers raising and lowering, the continuous roar of engines as operations continued throughout the day. It is difficult to imagine sustaining such tempo under combat conditions, but the young men who served aboard Essex-class carriers did exactly that, day after day, for years of continuous warfare. The Japanese commanders who discovered that American carriers could recover aircraft in 90 seconds discovered something more profound than technical superiority. They discovered that American military thinking emphasized systematic efficiency over individual excellence, that American engineering prioritized sustained operations over peak performance, and that American industrial capacity could produce vessels incorporating innovations Japanese industry could not match even if Japanese naval architects had conceived of them. The 90-second recovery cycle was not merely a number, it was proof that different civilizations approach warfare differently. Japan brought centuries of martial tradition, individual excellence, and spiritual preparation. America brought systematic analysis, engineering innovation, and industrial mass production. The war determined which approach prevailed in modern industrial conflict. The answer was written in recovery times, 60 to 90 seconds for American carriers, 5 to 7 minutes for Japanese carriers. That difference, multiplied across thousands of recovery operations, across dozens of carriers, across years of continuous combat, proved decisive. The Essex-class carriers could fight faster, sustain longer, generate more sorties, and ultimately dominate the Pacific theater, not through individual heroism, though individual heroism was abundant on both sides, but through systematic superiority in the mundane matter of bringing aircraft aboard ship. Japanese commanders were stunned by 90-second recovery times, because those times represented a form of warfare Japan had not prepared for. They had prepared for battles of spirit, for decisive engagements, for samurai combat writ large with carriers and aircraft. They discovered too late they were fighting engineers who had systematically optimized every aspect of carrier operations for sustained industrial warfare. The Essex-class carriers, with their 90-second recovery cycles, were not merely ships. They were proof that modern warfare rewards systematic excellence over individual heroism, that sustained operations defeat decisive battles, and that the nation capable of bringing engineering discipline to every aspect of military operations holds an advantage no amount of courage can overcome. The Japanese commanders learned this lesson in the waters off Cape Engano, at Leyte Gulf, at the Philippine Sea, and in every carrier engagement of the Pacific War. They learned it too late to change the outcome, but thoroughly enough to understand how completely they had misunderstood the nature of the war they were fighting. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.